This assignment for Design Fundamentals is to create a series of 5 different collages that explore the dimensions of color. With each of these 5 collages, we are focusing on a given color quality, or what can be called in some circles dimensions of color. What is important is that you choose the colors that are required, that are asked for in each of the collages, rather than all sorts of varieties thrown together. There is the fifth collage, which really allows you to interpret and interweave as much as you want, which is much more creative in the sense of you're designing it completely yourself with color. But in each of these, it's a discipline. Each of these is purposely a bit of a pain because I would like you to really find, perceive, be aware of a given color quality or qualities in the environment, which is why also we're requiring magazine clippings, things that can be found in the real world. You want to choose magazine papers and printed material that is substantially able to be glued down. Don't go for newspaper magazines or rather cheap papers. Go for the magazines that are high quality in their paper stock and in their print. These collages should be rectangles, not squares. That's possible, but I would rather they be rectangles. That aesthetically more interesting, and the composition gets more interesting if they're rectangles. Their dimensions, and this is the dimension of the collage itself, not the border, the sort of mount that you'll put underneath it. But the smallest edge should be no less than 4 inches, and the longer, perhaps around 6, maybe more, perhaps more. If you find that you have a lot of the appropriate material, the material, the clipping material and colors that are called for in each of these things, to make a larger composition. What I would like to do right now is to give you some pointers to go through some technical aspects of putting together the dimensions of color collages, which will be done from magazine clippings. So in this case, you're really required to go out on your own to find a stack of magazines. Check the text and the explanation for the assignment, exactly how to do that. But magazines of a certain stock and catalogs, the junk mail catalogs that you get through the mail might be another source of clippings that have various kinds of colors. There is the issue of where you get the magazines, how you obtain the magazines, and I really do not want you to go out and buy them, except as a very last resort, and not too many if that's the case. But friends and family, people who are trying to get rid of their magazines, recycling institutions and organizations that might have lots of stacks of magazines that can safely be picked up and used. The materials you're going to use for this particular assignment are your heavier paper, the Bristol board, the immaculate white Bristol board. You'll be cutting down sheets that are smaller than this, but that will be the material that will be the base, the foundation of the collages themselves. Obviously, your rubber cement, which you used in your last assignment for the figures and fields. The stack of magazines and materials that you've arranged and acquired. A ruler. Your kit does have a smaller ruler, a metal ruler than this, which helps in getting straight edges in the cuts. And as far as the cutting surface is concerned, got the X-Acto knife, but the cutting surface, you can use the back of your pad, either the sketch pad or the Bristol board, or you can pick up a hopefully inexpensive self-healing cutting board from any kind of art or craft store. So the raw materials, the materials we're going to use for this exercise are the magazine clippings. And first off, because we're dealing with different color definitions, different organizations and objective, things that we can agree on about color qualities, it's best to clip out, well, perhaps with scissors at first because it's so easy, clip out your color raw material in various piles. And I would say the ones you need are the achromatics, the grays, blacks, and whites, okay? Various hues, these are the magazines, but various hues going from violet through blue, through green, through yellow, through orange, and red. And that would be the basic physical spectrum that you're dealing with in terms of color. And then because you have a wonderful free-for-all as the final fifth collage, you may take out whatever is interesting, clip out whatever is interesting as complex and varied and hard to define textures of colors. They can be certainly from photographs of representational things, okay? But they become the raw material for your final collage. An important thing to do to get these assignments ready to go is for you to either get envelopes or file folders, or what would be perfect, I don't have one right now, but those smallish manila clasp envelopes are fine, but some sort of folders for the grays, the purples, the blues, the greens, the yellows, oranges, and reds. And then finally, for that free-for-all collage at the end, where you're welcome to do all sorts of complexities and textures. Now, the guiding principle, the guiding, thoughtfulness and intuition that you're going to be using in this particular assignment is contrast. In other words, what against what begins to look good. Don't have to be huge black and white contrasts, although they could be, but the idea for these kinds of collages is to end up with a whole surface of elaborate, solid and textural contrasts that become a mysterious and interesting abstraction. Try to play with the contrast that you might be seeing with each of these achromatic values. I'm almost accidentally and arbitrarily putting things together that might be a kind of jumble, that might be a kind of chaos right now. But if you, without gluing at first, because the nice thing about collage is that you can decide things before you glue, you could play a game with all sorts of interesting and contrasting, in this case, achromatic color qualities. And then as you mass them, get them a little bit bigger, perhaps, you then can cut a right-angled rectangle. You can draw and then cut a right-angled rectangle from that, okay? And then place it on another larger portion of Bristol board to make a cleaner design. It makes for a cleaner and more neatly bordered design in all of your collages. Just as you've done with your figure feels, there's no mystery about the application of rubber cement. Just get another scrap paper, as you did in the beginning exercise, and make sure that the glue is moderately but entirely covering, moderate thickness but entirely covering the back side of the magazine clipping. And as I said, what I'm going to do in this case is to put down a number of shapes arbitrarily at first, and have it grow out from the center, and then crop them, make the edges of the collage as I move out into a larger area. The alternative is to draw a rectangle, to draw the size of the collage that you want, and then carefully fit pieces into that. And I found that it works both ways, but I found that this way sometimes allows you more unexpected surprises and contrasts and complexities than you would in the beginning. I love the idea of there being things that are intricate and mysterious, and are actually, obviously, photographs from the real world, but have become somewhat abstracted. And the importance of that is that not that I'm after, well, let's try for that. Not that I'm after abstraction all the time, but if our objective in this course is for you to really become familiar with different qualities of color, okay? I'm not really interested in doing pictures. I'm interested in your trying to see those colors, perceive those colors, and use the contrasts within those particular color definitions to really have a firm grasp of what's happening here, of what you're making into a very dynamic and interesting composition, because you're really looking at various kinds of qualities, lights and darks in this case, okay, and you're juxtaposing them in ways that bring out those contrasts. So I will take this series of arcs here, and because they're so optically dynamic and zebra-like, I'm going to put it across these two zones here. You can obviously pile things on top of one another. There's no reason why everything has to lock in like a picture puzzle, but you do need to test and place and move things so that they are, in the end, a distribution of different qualities, a distribution of different differences. Okay, I mean, in some ways, the design sense is the designer is one who's taking various different parts and putting them together. You know, your task is to make a whole. That's with a W. A whole out of many things that are seemingly disorganized and not interesting. So, you know, if I were to do this now, I'm going to take a chance in doing this. You know, let the accident happen. Yes, you can sort of pre-plan a few things, but let a lot of things just almost arbitrarily, you know, with your putting them next to one another, arbitrarily grow and become a kind of pattern that's not preconceived. And that guiding idea of having things that are very different that somehow seem in the end to work together. Since I've gotten to a certain point in here and we'll cut a rectangle from this, I'm not going to try at this point to fill out any more. What I'll do is I'll play a game with papers, straight edges, in this case envelopes that you're seeing right here, and I'm going to play with possible cropping, possible proportions and cutting of the rectangle. You know, this is why the overkill with the collage material is sometimes better than trying to fit it in at the beginning into a rectangle. So something like that is going to be something that I'll cut out. And then, because I don't want, and you don't want, to have any of the paper showing through and the Bristol board showing through, I will then do a few details that begin to close it off and complete it in those corners. These are some crucial tips about mounting your work. You're going to be using your Bristol board as a mount, as the solid piece on which you're going to mount the collage. And I think the easiest way to get yourself a margin, you could measure it, you could take some time to do it in a complex way, but one of the easier ways to do it, and should work for these scale collages, is using your ruler as a margin. In other words, the very width of your ruler becomes the width of your mount. And if you start up in this corner, one corner, with a right-angled margin, you come in equally on both sides, the width of the ruler, you're going to end up with this particular corner as being a very true right angle upon which you can place the collage and make sure it's in the direction you want it to go, because there's a little bit of an option to make the mat larger at the bottom. But if you put that in as accurately as you can and mark off a width, an edge, a width, an edge, you can then take, again, your ruler and mark off the very edge of the collage mount, which will be cut, and it'll be something like that. And then down here, it will be something like that. So you have a sort of ready-made right-angled system to work with. And if you don't have, you're not likely to have the right triangle, but the edge of a piece of Bristol board will give you a kind of right-angled accuracy if you want to check these things. So I've cut this out as best I can to a true set of right angles. Now, in terms of the proportions of your collage, it is probably more artful, more expressive if you use a rectangle rather than a square, although a square is possible. I'm going to take the collage and just check that it fits in this space that I've done. Okay. I suppose beforehand you should cut out the mat itself. Before I glue, I'm going to cut out the mat, and that will be fairly easy to do. Now note that I've got a little bit of a margin, this double line down here. Traditionally and perceptually in visual art, it is best if you have the bottom edge of the mat or the mount a little bit wider than the other three sides. It gives you a little bit more weight, and visually it seems more stable that way. And also, there's no mistaking as to which end is up in terms of the collage itself. So I'm going to take, I will use the wider edge here. You're welcome to do that, or keep it even all the way around. And I'm going to cut better, especially with the Bristol board, better light motion and relatively gentle pressure, as opposed to pressing it through in one fell swoop, which is likely to make it jump and be less accurate. So I've got my, if I erase this, I've got my museum regulation bottom edge here. I can cut this final right edge here. Again, for safety's sake, fingers away from the blade. Make sure the ruler is stable. You're all bright enough to know this stuff, but sometimes you can get so passionate you forget about the safety factor. So there I've got the true proportions of my mount, and it's a simple matter at this point of taking the collage, and just as you've done in your figure fields, you're using rubber cement. This one's got a little bit more of an area to cover, but again, about the same principle in terms of moderate thickness, not too gloppy, but again, right out to the edge so you don't have your collage lifting off the mount. Low on my rubber cement. So it seemed to be fairly even and thoroughly spread. And then it's simply a matter of taking this, but make sure you know which end is up on your collage, and make sure it aligns and is appropriate with the margin at the bottom if you've chosen to do that. So I think it's this way, and I'm going to drop it into that rectangle that I've got there. And the nice thing about the rubber cement is you can play around with it a little bit. And again, as you've done in the other collages, go down a little bit to that edge. Excellent. I'm going to press it. And you have something close in this intro class to a museum piece. Now this first one is an achromatic collage, and you've gathered your materials and put it in an envelope and And you should overkill the materials that you think you're going to use. Better to have too many than too few. And the biggest pain in this one, the biggest challenge in this one, is to find stock printing, black and white photographs, graphic design, that is absolutely achromatic. That means that what might appear to be a kind of black in a magazine, what might appear to be a kind of white, what might appear to be a pure middle gray, or any number of grays, could have a slightly different cast of another color quality in it, and we're trying to avoid that. But despite the fact that you're so limited in your color choices, um, I do think the next few will show you that you can get extremely creative, extremely individual, in your design and in your evolving a collage, which which should be open-ended in terms of the kinds of shapes you use, as long as they, with the experience of your figure fields, as long as they make a coherent design that really focuses on the contrasts. In other words, you don't want to have too much of one color necessarily in the given collage. Now again, in this achromatic collage, you can see a kind of writhing, organic, nature-oriented set of shapes, and that there may be a little predominance of blacks and dark values, but nonetheless, there's enough distribution, there's enough variety in there to make a strong set of contrasts. So although we're not doing a picture necessarily, we're not doing a sort of photographic reality, there is a real invention in having a variety of that stuff in there. And note, especially in the black and white and achromatic collage, photographic material that has texture, that has realistic detail, could be incorporated, because you're cutting it up in a way that really disallows that being seen. In other words, you can use texture, you can use real images if they're cut up in a way that just emphasizes the value differences. And you can see in this one that almost the exact opposite in terms of a structure. With your ruler, with your X-Acto knife, you can get very precise, very right-angled, or very geometric with these things, very architectural in a sense. So, both ends of the spectrum in terms of attitude of design, organic, natural, free-flowing things, and almost an architectural geometry are possible. And in this one, you've got a real elaborate sort of squiggly sandbar or desert pattern, wind pattern texture going on here. So there's a collision of different kinds of details that are nicely contrasted to the more open areas that are up to the right and left. And in this one, a nice combination of blocky, solid shapes plus textures. I like the chaos of this one, a kind of fractured semi-geometry that seems to be a kind of jumble of almost broken form. Almost a kind of dense, complicated, textural Father's Day tie in achromatic values. And unlike the one a while back that had sort of fractured, broken semi-geometries, this one here is very organic. It's almost like amoebas and organic form colliding in a space. So what's obvious in this one is that you could use printing. If you want to do something that's deliberately a message, that's okay. But basically, your decisions are going to be design and contrast. So block lettering, any kind of lettering that's achromatic would be great. Just keep the objective of making things contrasted. And the other thing I see in this one, it may be a matter of photography, it may indeed be the actual collage, is that you see the big gray field, that big gray space that's sort of uniform in what seems to be the behind all these forms. That's ever so slightly a bit of a temperature change. To me, it seems on second and third view a little bit purple in somewhere, gray purple in some areas. So it's not off the charts. I mean, you're not going to have to go crazy about this, but do be aware of the fact that grays, and especially whites, sometimes do not have a purity of value. fairly sophisticated one here that's a combination of organic and geometric. I especially like the textural parts of this contrasted to the sort of black organic form up top. Very detailed and claustrophobic, but also beautifully expansive and empty in some areas. Now, in design, there's always the issue of how much is too much and how little is too little. What I love about this one here is that it rubs up against the extreme of just having a few shapes down there, but they're so elegantly placed. They're so empty. They're so beautifully proportioned in a kind of intuitive way. There's no rule for this, that it really becomes a gorgeous collage. So now almost the opposite with this almost sci-fi monstrous organic shape in there. You can hint at things from the real world. You can hint at things from fantasy. You can hint at things that are almost realistic and associative imagery. But focus on and keep the main objective, the contrasts of the grays. So this second collage is very related to the first one in that it's still a value structure, a light and dark structure, but instead of white and black, you're thinking of a color, a given hue, okay, and white added to it in the printing matter, going out to white, and perhaps a few accents of the color plus black. So you have light and dark versions of a single hue. And I think the restriction here is to try to keep it within that hue, no matter how light or how dark it gets. I think you all know, the style options that we talked about in the first group of collages. So let's just take a look at what's been done in this value contrast in a single hue collage. This one is predominantly dark with some light accents, and it's a little bit more organic in its shape. With both this one and the previous one thing to keep in mind when you're gathering raw materials for this collage is that it's likely, it's not absolutely necessary, but it's likely you'll find most raw material for value changes in a single hue with blue. Given advertisements of travel, sky, water, you end up with a lot of photography and a lot of graphic design as having many blues. The thing you have to watch out for, and this would be that the blues don't sort of move towards a purple or move towards a gray. So although I've said blue is the most easily obtainable hue for the value structures, there is the possibility of dark primary or secondary colors. It's very hard to do the oranges or the yellows or light greens, whatever, but any kind of dark hue that has a kind of readily available set of lighter versions of itself from different magazines is fine. This one here is a purple, sort of bluish purple, but a purple that does just that. Another blue one that has a nice bunch of details in it, mostly stripes. With your cutting and with your gluing, you're invited to do sometimes the most efficient set of forms that can be cut out. If you want to do fancy organic things, that's great. But as long as you have a grouping of contrasts of different values within a single hue, you're in business. So with the definition of intensity as opposed to value, we've got a bit of a conceptual thing to, idea thing, a definition thing to think through. With value, especially when it's a chromatic value, a color that changes light and dark, you have differences in the strength of that color, but they go through a light and dark transition. With intensity, you're trying as best you can to keep the values, the lightness and darkness of the hue you've chosen, the same, but you're changing only the intensity versus neutrality, or brightness versus dullness, okay? Brightness versus dullness is different from lightness versus darkness. Brightness versus dullness is the intensity change. And what you're going to try to do is find a hue in several different levels of intensity that can be contrasted against a darker, browner, muddier version of that hue. So the famous, given my teaching, the sort of repetitive analogy I make is the red fire truck in front of the brick wall at some distance. If it's an entirely red fire truck and it's the same value as the brick wall at a distance, you've got a browner brick wall, a browner brick wall against a brighter red fire truck. It's that kind of difference, that kind of contrast you're after. And I should, since I'm dealing with fire trucks and red here, just as blue tended to be the most prevalent color with which to play with values in a single hue, so red, given fashion magazines, food magazines, restaurant advertisements, red tends to be the most prevalent, the most easy to find hue with which to do intensity contrasts. Because of the difficulty in finding the material with the intensity and even the red contrasts, you're welcome to simplify things to the nth degree. It's almost as if, they don't have to be this way, but it's almost as if you had something close to the reversible figure field relationship that you had in your first assignment. That would be a good way to use a luckily found large amount of bright red and the happy accident of having a large amount of dull red. Although I wish there were a few more bright reds in this one, like sprinkled all over, like Jimmy's in an ice cream or some kind of distribution, that lower red against the background that you see is a near perfect intensity contrast, where you have a bright version of the color, a strong version of the color, a saturated version of the color, against a dull version of the color. This is a great dramatic design. The only minor thing I would take issue with is that you're going to try to make as close as possible the values of the dull reds and the bright reds. So although it's a kind of interesting shape, that darker shape at the top could be a little bit more light in keeping with the other reds. And I think this one could also use a little bit more of a distribution of brighter reds as well. And although these intensity contrasts are never going to hit you over the head with strong optical vibrations, they do represent a kind of deep note, a low note, a kind of cello aesthetic or artfulness in color manipulation. Here, color-wise, we've got a breath of fresh air. This is relatively easy to understand, and what you're doing in these particular collages is contrasting hues, the 6 primary and secondary colors. And all it really requires is that you find a solid, strong, intense version of each of those 6 hues, and that you freely juxtapose them, put them together in various kinds of combinations. This is where you really can use the idea of complementary colors. That's a fancy term. You've got it in your list of color definitions. Complementary with an LE, not LI. Colors are those colors that are opposite one another on the color wheel, the orange and the blue, the red and the green, the yellow and violet. They, when they're put next to each other, excite one another. They really energize and intensify one another. If we were using, as we will soon, any kind of paint, tempera paint, gouache, oil paint, acrylic paint, and you mix the two complements together, what do you get? Those of you who've painted before know that they sort of kill each other. They sort of neutralize each other when you mix them together. So an interesting optical dynamic here. The pigments themselves make them, when you mix them, get weaker and duller. And when you put them next to each other, they intensify one another. Not that you have to use that all across this design, but just keep in mind that especially with the orange, which tends to be a weaker color in printed material, you can energize it by putting it next to a blue. So, I've said that these have to be abstract, but this one to me almost takes its organization from a landscape. There's a kind of horizontality to it. There's a kind of mountainous region. And you notice that all the colors themselves are are solid, and that would mean that you, as I've said before, you find a single source for them, or you find identical looking versions of them from different sources. If there's one minor footnote to this one, I wish, it's not bad, it's intense, but I wish the green were just a little less yellow and more of an in-between cool and warm green. Great dynamic diagonal composition, and what's really remarkable in this one is how the blue and the orange reinforce one another. We talked about the complements before, and you can see that sort of semi-middle strip of vertical orange being energized by the blues to either side. What happens in regular printed materials, I've said before, is that the orange tends to be kind of brown, and this makes up for it. And as in all of these designs, you can be inspired by things in the real world. I can't help but thinking that this is almost a kind of quilt. This one pretty much speaks for itself. I think the craft is excellent. I think the idea that some of the pieces in there are almost linear, like paintbrush marks or pencil marks or ink marks, is a tribute to the craft. Beautiful composition. Very lively one that really speaks for itself. It's got a beautiful sort of stable structure, but at the same time just enough small and large activity to make it dynamic. Beautiful craft, beautiful color choices. Some of you may be communication majors, taking graphic design courses and web design courses in communication. If you think about letters and symbols, those sort of blocky, wonderful forms can be a great inspiration in these particular color exercises. We've pretty much gone through all the issues and possibilities of the design aspects of this. Just keep in mind that you really need that brightest of colors, that color of one of the 6 primary and secondary colors, and that it's your job to rearrange them. Very mysterious sort of form in the center, pretty straightforward blocky things to the outside and in back, but I love that sort of calligraphic figure with the 2 horns that's in the center. And even though we're dealing with abstract form and sort of made up shapes, I love the animation and analogy to a kind of party time, the energy in this one here. Unlike all the others you've done so far, you can make no legal or technical mistake in your color choices in this. It's just that you've been thrown back on your own freedom, your own decision making, your own aesthetic sense, and your own artfulness in coming up with something that could actually use all the scraps, or most of the things that you threw away in the others that didn't quite match up to the requirements of the collage. So I'll just take you on a tour of these very different and very individual collages that play with the mixed and matched color qualities of textures and solids, intensities, neutralities, lights and darks, cools and warms. All the color qualities can be brought together. Strong graphic design here with a kind of chaos of many colors in back and a kind of diagonal set of bars of these darker forms. Now here's an issue where I almost contradicted myself by showing you this. In this free interpretive piece, the number 5, you can hint a little bit more, if not deliver a little bit more, in terms of pictures, in terms of images that are recognizable, if indeed they are good format for a lot of different kinds of color. Okay, back to abstraction with these diagonal lines. Beautiful format for any kind of color quality. When you put one line against another, one paint stroke against another, one bar of color against another, there's usually kind of vibration and beautiful contrast among them. So this one really plays out a lot of different contrasts within that format. And since you've got the freedom to use any and all sorts of color qualities, this is where photographs, textures, details, things that are somewhat recognizable can be used in your color contrasts. Another very subtle and sensitive one were these vertical stripes take what are probably a lot of photographic detail and recognizable things, but slice them, dice them up into narrow strips where they become a kind of fabric texture. And another proof that even though you're using abstract shapes, they can be arranged, they can be cut, they can be played with in a way that suggests and really communicates a movement, a motion, an energy, a kind of dynamism that's not simply a still surface.